Hello, thank you for joining the Korea Society's 8th Annual Korean War Armistice Day commemoration. Armistice Day offers a special opportunity to express gratitude for those who served in the Korean War to defend democracy and the people of South Korea. After 158 meetings spread over 2 years and 17 days, 71 years ago, on this day at 10 a.m., military authorities from the US, China, and North Korea signed the longest negotiated armistice in modern history, bringing an end to a brutal war and ushering a provisional step towards a formal political peace treaty, which, however, has yet to be signed. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War. But even those who forgot the sacrifices made by thousands of American, South Korean, and UN troops cannot overlook the outcome of that sacrifice, the preservation of human dignity, the sparks of a thriving democracy, and the economic and cultural powerhouse that now is the Republic of Korea. The price of freedom was very costly in terms of lives, including South Korea and the US. 17 nations sent combat forces under the United Nations command. Nearly 5 million people perished. More than half of the casualties were civilians, about 10% of the pre-war population of Korea. South Korea's combatant deaths numbered almost 138,000, while about 37,000 American soldiers died in Korea. United Nations forces suffered 140,000 casualties, wounded and killed. I am standing at the site of the Korean War Veterans Memorial in historic Battery Park, facing New York Harbor. Currently, the entire park is under construction. If we could see the monument behind the green construction walls over there, it features a 15-foot-high black granite stele with the shape of a Korean War soldier cut out of the center. It's one of the first constructed in the United States. Also known as the Universal Soldier, the figure forms a silhouette that allows viewers to see through the monument to the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, the entry point of many immigrants, including my Irish ancestors, into this great country. The silhouette's physical void reinforces a literal theme of absence and loss, and serves as a metaphor for those who made the ultimate sacrifice in the defense of freedom and of the people of South Korea. This is a sentiment that we hope to rekindle today, a tribute to the actions and sacrifices carried out 71 years ago by veterans who fought back against tyrannical aggression. For this year's ceremony, Korean War veterans have gathered at the Korea Society for special remarks, a performance of taps, and an engaging panel discussion that focuses on that time in history, 1953, and reflects on the sacrifices and lessons learned from the Korean War and the signing of the armistice. The Korea Society was founded here in New York City 66 years ago, just 4 years after the armistice, by our first president, General James A. Van Fleet, the longest-serving UN commander during the Korean War. The security ties between the two countries were codified in the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty, which the US and South Korean governments signed just months after the armistice, and ratified by the US Congress in 1954. The alliance has proved to be resilient to internal and external challenges and resistant to misinformed notions that it is out of date or unnecessary for maintaining peace and stability in Northeast Asia. As we reflect on the Korean War veterans, we should realize that their sacrifices form the bedrock of the deep relationship between the people of Korea and America.
Hello everybody, my name is Hannah Kim, founder of Remember 77. I'm here at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. So you'll see on my right behind me, the Washington Monument. I'm going to give you a tour and explain a little bit about the significance of July 27th, the National Korean War Veterans Armistice Day. So on my right, you see all the names of the countries that fought under the United Nations command. Many people don't know that countries like Luxembourg sent soldiers, as well as Netherlands, New Zealand, Colombia, and of course India and Italy, they sent medical support. Here you will see 19 statues of soldiers in the war. And most people, when they come, they say it looks so real. And reflected against that wall over there, the 19 becomes 38, symbolizing 38th parallel. Of course, the line that divides North and South Korea. This memorial was dedicated in 1995 on July 27th by President Clinton. If you can see, there's a soldier right there. His name is Colonel William E. Weber. He not only served in World War II, but also in Korea, where he lost an arm and a leg. His comrades, more than 36,000 Americans, never made it home. He wanted to honor every single one. And so he lobbied to pass legislation that could add a wall of remembrance that would etch the names of not only the Americans who died, but also the Korean soldiers who fought as part of the augmentation to the United States Army. So here you will see names, and it's so moving and touching because you see American names and you see Korean names. And it really symbolizes how we were united in our effort to defend freedom and democracy, not only just in Korea, but around the world. So as you can see, there are all the names of the American soldiers alongside Korean soldiers like these that have fought alongside together, but including Thomas J. Byrne, who is the uncle of Korea Society's president, Thomas Byrne, and who was named after in honor of his uncle. Now I'm going to take you to the part where you have probably seen in the photos. You see the front view of all the 19 soldiers, as well as the wall on the left. But this is also a very familiar and famous inscription. It says, "Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met." So if you can just join me in a moment of silence as I lay this flower in honor of all those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. When I first came to this memorial in 2007, I was inspired because I really didn't know much about this so-called forgotten war, nor did I know so many people sacrificed for my freedom. And I wanted to do something about it. And I lobbied Congress to pass legislation that designated July 27th as the National Korean War Veterans Armistice Day. And every year since actually 2008, I've been commemorating this day with an event. And we light a candle exactly at 7:27 p.m. in honor of all those who died and sacrificed. As you know, there are so many casualties in South Korea as well, and more than 100,000 Korean American divided families who have yet to see their loved ones in North Korea. So I hope wherever you are today at 7:27 p.m., you can pause in honor of all those who paid the ultimate sacrifice and just to hope for peace on the Korean Peninsula, remembering that freedom is not free.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your coming. So actually, this is my pleasure to be with you at this very meaningful moment. The war is not over yet. It's merely in a state of suspension. Just 20 miles north of Seoul, thousands of North Korean long-range artillery and the missiles are aimed at South Korea. That's the reality. Despite the unfinished state of war and the constant threats from the North, South Korea has achieved miraculous prosperity over the past 70 years based on the Republic of Korea US alliance. It has not only achieved remarkable economic development that surprises the world, but has also become a cultural powerhouse with soft power that captivates people globally. I would like to take this opportunity to express on behalf of the Korean government my deepest gratitude for the sacrifices of the Korean War veterans from America and the support of the United States, which made this proud Republic of Korea possible. Now, I would like to conclude my short speech. I would like to talk about the Roman Empire. Rome, which maintained its great empire for 1,230 years, adhered to one principle. Whether at the war, during a ceasefire, or in peace negotiations, they always remained armed and prepared for enemy invasion. This is because the only thing that they can trust is not a peace treaty, but their own military strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. And let's have Judith, Staff Sergeant Judith Glunt. Before jumping into the discussion, I would like to provide the brief bios of the panelists with us today. Their extensive experience can be found on the Korea Society website. Dr. David Fields, to the right, earned his PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in US-Korea relations. He is the author of Foreign Friends, Syngman Rhee, American Exceptionalism, and the Division of Korea, and the editor of the Diary of Syngman Rhee, 1904-1934, 1944, published by the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History. Major Rachel Kim is an instructor of economics at the Department of Social Sciences at the U.S. Military Academy. Her research focuses on economic growth and development, economic and financial statecraft, industrial policy, and counter-threat finance. And Salvatore Scarlato is Korean War Veterans Area Commander. He joined the Korean War Veterans Central Long Island chapter in September 1989. He began as a member, then was voted as a director, event chairman, first vice president, and today is the president. He has been the president of this chapter in the Korean War Veterans Association, Department of New York, from 2009 to the present time. Moreover, of course, Sal, a good friend of the Korea Society, we could not do this event without him. So we're really glad that you could come again in person. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps in Korea from 1952 to 1953. So we'll do 3 rounds, so hopefully we can keep everything short, and then we'll have opportunity to have questions from the audience. The first round will focus on the war, the Armistice Agreement. The second round will focus on the Alliance Treaty and the immediate economic and political consequences. And the third round will focus on current military, economic, and political factors affecting the alliance and its future prospects. So starting off with round 1, Sal, can you please tell us what it was like being there in Korea on the front lines in 1952? Now, the armistice negotiations had started on July 10th, 1951, so you were there. Even though the armistice talks were going on, there was still a lot of action.
Yes. Well, I was considered what we call the stalemate Marine, which means that we could not proceed beyond the 38 parallel as much as possible. The only time we could, it was approximately 20 miles into North Korea. Like I said, we were stalemate Marines. We were like a yo-yo, going back and forth. But when I first went to Korea, there's 4 letters in the dictionary that means Korea. H-E-L-L. It's hell. The reason I say it's hell because it was a war. And people get killed in war. People get mangled in war. People get crippled, especially children. When you see children mangled, it's very heartbreaking. When I first went to Korea, I hated it. I hated it with a passion because I didn't realize what war can do to a human body. And when I went down into the landing barge, it didn't hit me right away until I hit the wall. And the first bullet that hit my helmet knocked my helmet off. I was just turned 19, and it was horrifying. I cried. I prayed. I think I prayed to every religion that was on the face of the earth. And I also got combat wounded, and it made it worse. But an incident happened to me which changed my whole attitude towards Korea. Like anything else, I never knew what Korea was, where Korea was, and the people of Korea. Like I said, I hated them all. But an incident happened to me. I'm not going to go to the story of 3 children. After this incident happened, I literally fell in love with the South Korean people because I could see what happened to children. There's over 70,000 after the war of orphanages in Korea. And there's one big orphanage, I don't remember their name, who really helps, and also the 2nd Army Division, really helps the Korean War, and also General Van Fleet. General Van Fleet had the same attitude. But once he knew the Koreans, he fell in love with the Korean people and the Korean Peninsula. This is why this organization exists, Korean Society. And he actually formed the ROK Army to what it is today. With his ability, with his knowledge, and with his support of the Korean government. Like I say, war is hell. There's no explanation, and there's no theory or no reasoning when you're on the front lines and you say to yourself, why am I here? Why am I here? And no one could give you that answer. Your superiors can't tell you because they don't really know. And it's for freedom. It's for freedom so people can live a normal life and not under the communism rules and laws. And like I said, I changed my opinion on certain things about the Koreans and the Korean people. And my first South Korean I met in 1991 in front of a statue delivering flowers on a memorial that we have in Suffolk County. And since 91 to present time, I know many, many, many Korean people, Korean organizations, and they are my brothers and sisters. And I'm proud to be that I was a Marine in the Korean War. And I know too many people did the ultimate sacrifice that made Korea's got to be the 10th best economy country in the world, I believe, isn't it? Think about that on their own and with their own government. It's fantastic.
Well, thanks for making it all very real, perhaps too real for us. So maybe we can take another perspective now. So, Professor Kim, can you provide an overview of what was it like, not during the war, but Korea's economic situation right before the war? I mean, what did Korea have? What resources? What did it have going into this war?
Yeah, and I think it might be, well, first off, thank you for having me. Thank you to Korea Society for having me in distinguished panels and guests here. Really, it's a testament to the strength and diversity of the Alliance. But to your question of the economy, I think it's very familiar for us to associate it with our modern day context of GDP, right? Gross domestic product, which is monetary value of all goods and services. But if you really think about what the economy represents and what it's supposed to show is a measure of a well-being of a country, the allocation of scarce resources. And that economic security is fundamentally dependent on sound institutions, on political regimes that dictate the allocation of those resources, the ability for individuals to enter contracts, right, and engage in economic activity, and also the right to property, so property laws, and that also pertains to human capital. So all those pillars are fundamental to economic security. And as Sal has very poignantly mentioned, war has a tremendous cost. So if you know Korean's history, the Korean Peninsula's history, this is as throughout history, not the peninsula itself, not north or south, it's always consistently been the nexus of geopolitical tension between great powers, whether it's China or Japan, or even internally, right? Civil wars going back to the Three Kingdoms and that dynasty era. And so all of that inhibits a government to mobilize the full factors of production to recognize its economic security, or economic potential for that matter. And even under Japanese colonial rule, right, that was an extractive institution, all the factors of production were mobilized, but for the Japanese economy. And so in 1945, after 35 years of Japanese colonial rule, the conditions were not great, right? Agricultural, industrial base were diminished. And so they were in this identity of rebuilding, right? I think that's the crux of the Korean identity. But also at the same time, after World War II, Soviet Union controlled the North, the US controlled the South. And so you also had a very divergent governance structure as well as economies. But there, in the southern part at least, there was a protection of this institution, right? A protection of the sound institution of a democratic republic, an economic foundation based off a democratic republic system. And so as a distinguished scholar on my right will say, President Rhee, Syngman Rhee, he initiated land reforms so that farmers could have a taste of property rights. And so all that was great progress, and from nothing they were able to rebuild and, they call it creative destruction or whatnot through its economic glide path. But at least they understood these are what we need to establish in order to recognize our economic potential and really ensure well-being of our country. Of course, that progress was thwarted by the Korean War, but it's my personal opinion, but I think that was the seed that planted the seed of post-war economic recovery to the point where they were the poorest nation in the world to now the 10th economy. And so for that, that's how I would like to paint Korea at that time, at the peninsula as well as the southern region.
I'd like one follow-up question, but first, I'm really impressed with your understanding of the economic fundamentals. I think you could work for a credit rating agency.
That's hiring, just kidding.
The determinants of credit fundamentals. So, so South Korea did have an army in 1950, right? The Republic of Korea, which was established in 1948. How did it was very poor. Did it have enough resources to have some sort of army? I mean, where did it get its resources to field whatever type of army it had in 1950?
At that time, a lot of it was dependent on international aid.
Mhm.
The U.S. obviously provided a lot of that aid in its own proxy Cold War. And they did have a diminished yet existent industrial and agricultural base.
Right.
But that's probably where they were able to extract as much productivity from that in order to fuel an army. But much of it, and to this day, continues to be the alliance and some of that support from the U.S.
Right, right. Well, of course, in 1950 or from 48 to 1950, was the U.S. providing military assistance to South Korea?
They were, but perhaps not to the extent as we are familiar with during the Korean War.
Right, right. Okay. So Korea enters this war basically resource deprived, and the war is fought for about a year, and then the armistice negotiations start, which lasted 2 years. So what was Syngman Rhee's role in the armistice negotiations, David?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. To say that Syngman Rhee played a negative role in the armistice negotiations would be somewhat of an understatement. So beginning in August of 1951, he actually covertly drops bombs near the negotiation site in Kaesong before it's moved to Panmunjom to try to disrupt the negotiations, to try to make the communist negotiators feel unsafe. And that was just the beginning. From that point on, he uses his representatives at the negotiations to leak information about the negotiations, which he will then publicly release to try to discredit the negotiators. He's constantly speaking openly against the armistice. And then finally, on June 18th of 1953, he takes his most extreme action, which is he releases 28,000 North Korean POWs into South Korea after the negotiations at Panmunjom had decided that they would be turned over to the personnel of neutral nations to ascertain whether they wanted to be repatriated or not. He just completely short-circuits that process by releasing them into South Korea, having them disappear, hoping that the communist side will get so angry that they will walk away from the negotiations, which they do for about a month. They eventually do come back. So why was Rhee so hostile to these armistice negotiations? I think it's really important to understand that Lee Syngman did not believe that the ROK only ruling one half of the Korean peninsula was a viable state. He thought as long as Korea was divided into two separate states, it could not be truly independent. It would be weakened, and that sooner or later it would be either incorporated into a Soviet empire or, and this is hard for us to believe today, a reemergent Japanese empire. Syngman Rhee had very little faith that the United States would be able to successfully pacify and control Japan. So he was thinking at some point in the future, likely Japan is going to be the reemergent power of East Asia. They're going to be looking at expanding their sphere of influence. And if Korea is divided and weak, there's no way it can maintain its independence. So Rhee was opposed to any end of the Korean War that left the division in place. And in fact, in letters to his supporters, he argues that in certain circumstances, it's actually better for democratic Korea to go down fighting than to accept a division that would leave it in a permanently weakened state. I think Lee Syngman would be as surprised as anyone today, if not more so, to see what the Republic of Korea had become. Now, eventually, he comes to tacitly abide by the armistice when he realizes that no matter what he does, the communist side is not going to walk away, because they need the armistice for their own reasons. So he comes to tacitly accept it and abide by it, but he will not support it. He will not sign it. He will openly attack it for the rest of his political career, and he will occasionally openly talk about violating it.
Right. And of course, the Republic of Korea did not sign the armistice, but the other three parties did, and that was okay.
They managed.
Or were there certain reservations on the part of the Chinese and the North Koreans?
They managed to fudge that issue by having one signatory for all of the UN forces in Korea, which obviated the need for anyone from the ROK to sign it. Ultimately, at the very last moment, Lee Syngman did send a witness to the signing ceremony, which Mark Clark was greatly hoping that he would. And Choi Duk-shin at the very end does show up to witness the signing. But yes, he will never sign it or openly support it.
Right. Okay. So now I'd like to move up a bit in history. So the armistice is signed on July 27th, 1953. And the hostilities were over. We can't say, as Consul General Kim said, that the war is over, but the hostilities are over. Sal, where were you on the day the armistice signed? Were you in the U.S.? And if you were, what was it like coming back to the U.S. after having fought in Korea? When, what I understand, when the World War II veterans came back, they were treated as heroes. Was it different for the Korean War vets?
When I first came home, I came home in April of '53, and the only person that met me on the dock, and wasn't a dock with the airfield, was my father, my brother, and my two best friends, and my girlfriend. Nobody else. We didn't get a good welcome home. The only ones who welcomed us home was our families. But as far as the armistice is concerned, I was in a naval hospital at the time, recovering from some wounds that I received in Korea, and I was a bed patient. And when just before Corpsman came in and told us about the armistice was signed, I would just receive medication. And on it was actually July 28th, Corpsman came in with a jug of orange juice and a jug of 190 alcohol. And that was the creation of a screwdriver and a loaf of bread. They poured that into one container, did what they had to do, and they gave me this much in a cup. And I drank it like a dummy, and I got sick for 2 days because the medication they gave me affected me very badly. They had to pump my stomach out, and it wasn't a pleasant day for me to celebrate.
Well, I'm glad you pulled through.
Three days later, I decided, we finally ended the war. But the first 2 days, I was in agony. Every part of my body was in la la land. But as far as coming home, we did not get a parade. We did, I'm sorry. We got a parade in 1991, right here in Battery Park. That's when they unveiled a monument here, and they finally gave us a parade. And then in 1999, we got a big thing from, I believe it was Obama, big special medal, because that's the day, that's the year they declared war on North Korea, officially. Because before that, it was not declared a war, it was declared a police action. So technically, at the VA, we had no benefits. As a veteran, we had no benefits until they changed a lot of laws.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
And as of that, once they declared war, to us, there was no armistice. There was just no fighting. All the ceasefires stopped at 10 o'clock. Our numbers are 10 and 10. 10 in the morning and 10 at night. But unfortunately, to this day, they still don't get see eye to eye. And Korean War vets are still known as the forgotten war.
Another aspect of the forgotten war.
Never changed. The people, the American people or anybody, we have certain groups and certain Koreans that keep our legacy going, which is fantastic. And right now on a computer, it must be over about 5,000 Korean War vets with their names. I would say about over 10,000 books have been read about the Korean War. And unfortunately, we're perishing. There's approximately 20 Korean War vets dying per day. I'm 92. Most of the guys are 94. So what does that say about our legacy? Now, the only thing I would like to say, one thing, is two gentlemen here today that will keep our legacy going. And I want to say Paul Fitzsimmons and Howell, please. These guys are called defense veterans. And so far, nobody recognizes defense veterans. And you know who defense veterans are? They're Korean War veterans today who are stationed in Korea since 1955 to present time. 70 some odd years these gentlemen sit. If it wasn't for the Korean defense guys, what would Korea be today? Nobody thinks about that. If it wasn't for these guys, I think North Korea would have attacked us already. Again, thank you.
Right, and thank you for joining us today. Okay, so Rachel, taking a different angle. So, I mean, the Korean Peninsula, South Korea, was completely devastated by the war. 138,000 South Korean soldiers died in the war, if I got that number right. And I don't know how many civilians died, 1 million, maybe more, 2 million, South Korean, North Korean. How did South Korea keep going after the war? What could they do on their own, or who provided the initial aid to South Korea? Did it come from, which governments were stepped up and provided the aid to South Korea?
Yeah. Sorry, it's a very hard transition, but I just want to say thank you, Sal, to all the veterans here in the audience, but just across, anyone who's contributed to that, because it's truly their efforts and their sacrifice and what they had to go through, in which now veterans now can experience the benefits and the policy changes because of what had happened then. So thank you for really paving the path and just ensuring that veterans are never treated that way again.
Thank you.
Okay, let me just transition now back to the economics. So just as you've mentioned some numbers, let me just paint the picture to you in statistics. After the war, there was 1 million casualties, approximately 2.6 million refugees, 44% of industrial buildings were damaged, 4,800 devastated schools, 29% of houses destroyed, and 20% of power facilities were also destroyed. So it was complete economic destruction, if not just a societal destruction. And I want to continue the story that I was painting of the seeds that were planted, of this Korean identity of rebirth and regrowth. And I think that had a lot to do with its immediate efforts to rebuild its country by its own efforts and by its own means. So in light of such extensive damage to South Korean infrastructure, cities, and industrial facilities, going back to the soundness of institutions, one thing that I really think was critical to its future prosperity was that it first focused on the Constitution. So in 1948, promulgated the founding Constitution, which established a political system and basic rights of citizens under a rule of law. And once again, this fostered economic development because it guaranteed individual property rights and creative initiatives, so the individual to engage in economic activity under this institution. It also abolished the tenant farming system and redistributed land ownership to the farmers, which they were incentivized to increase their agricultural output and therefore reinvest in their households. And that creates the economic engine. In terms of how donors or how they received external aid, they did receive quite substantial economic aid, especially from the US and the UN forces at that time. But while donor countries were focused much more on providing humanitarian aid, the Koreans strived to receive aid in that form of infrastructure investment. So aid comprised more than 80% of total imports and then more than 50% of government budgets, which was, again, very, very tremendously reliant on external aid. But what Korea did really interestingly was that it invested its aid in rebuilding, once again, its industrial infrastructure and to guarantee subsistence living to all its citizens. And so after the Korean War, 30% of foreign aid was invested in things that cultivate human capital, education, healthcare, and capital, so infrastructure. And the other 70% were the development of the industrial base, initially for flour milling, sugar refining, textile weaving. And in this process, companies obviously were able to receive it at a lower discount price and then create its own economic engine, and thus the growth of small businesses and the industrial base. But one of the key components is that they understood how to invest in the factors of production, but what they really focused on especially was education. So not just at the household level, but through also an Education Reform Act, in which it basically eliminated illiteracy, not to obviously the full extent, but it helped promote now this human capital, which is then the source of innovation and this rapid economic growth.
Right. So despite this devastation, the South Korean authorities knew what to do. They invested in infrastructure, they invested in education, and that planted the seeds for the so-called economic miracle, the miracle on the Han, right?
Yes, and interesting as I go back to the North and South. Before the war, and still to this day, the North is incredibly wealthy in terms of natural resources. So what did South Korea, the Southern Peninsula, really have? And it had to rely on building this very strong domestic industrial base by investing in human capital, right? And then to cultivate a enterprise, like state-owned enterprises, chaebols to extent. There are trade-offs with it nowadays, but that was a strategy that was employed and quite effective, as we can see today.
Okay, so we had, turning over to Professor Fields, so Syngman Rhee tried to obstruct, but ultimately went along with the armistice, although I guess there were good strategic thinking in why he obstructed. This was very informative to me, hearing from you. I kind of think the real miracle in Korea was not the miracle on the Han. I mean, the miracle on the Han followed the miracle on the Rhine, and once you have good policies, and it's almost a rational, methodical process to have economic development. But we went from resistance to the armistice on the part of Syngman Rhee to the alliance, only 4 months, the Mutual Defense Treaty, almost 4 months later. I mean, how did that happen?
Yeah, so if Rhee's role in the armistice was a negative role, his role in the alliance was an incredibly positive role. And to fully understand it, we actually have to go all the way back to his time in prison between 1899 and 1904, when he's in prison for demanding reform of the Korean monarchy. And while he's in prison, he writes a remarkable book, his magnum opus, The Spirit of Independence, or Dongnip Changshin. And in that book, he predicts that Korea is going to lose its independence in the very near future. He's not the only one. Many Koreans are realizing this. And so he's trying to lay out a strategy for how Korea can regain its independence. And in this book, he lays out a strategy which I refer to as development from within and protection from without. So he understands that if Korea is going to regain its independence, all sorts of internal development is going to happen, and that's going to take time, but they're not going to have that time unless they have their security supported by an external patron. So that's development from within, protection from without. And soon after his release from prison, he goes to the United States, and for about 39 years in the United States, he's trying to make that a reality. He's trying to encourage Americans to play this role in guaranteeing Korea's independence. And he's mildly successful at convincing Americans at the grassroots level that this should be the case through a number of different mediums, but he's never able to convince the US government that it should actually accept this role. His activism, though, is key, I think, in the United States, just suggesting the division of Korea in the first place. But when he returns to Korea, especially when he becomes president of the ROK in 1948, immediately he is asking for the very least security guarantees from the United States, if not a mutual defense treaty, and he cannot get either one. He is really, really irate about the withdrawal of American troops from Korea in July of 1949, saying if you withdraw without any sort of security relationship, there's probably going to be a war. In fact, that is what happens. And all throughout the Korean War, he is continuously trying to get a mutual defense treaty with the United States, and he cannot get one because American policymakers do not want to make a long-term commitment to the Korean Peninsula. They don't believe it is strategically important. So as late as October of 1952, he's fighting with Secretary of State Dean Acheson, demanding a mutual defense treaty. And Acheson writes him and saying, there are American soldiers fighting and dying on the Korean Peninsula right now. What greater guarantee of your security do you want? And Lee Syngman says that that's not enough because he's worried at some point in the future the United States is going to want to withdraw from Korea. And he knows that a mutual defense treaty will put additional obstacles from that happening. So at the same time, he's being very obstinate about these armistice negotiations. So the Americans who are dealing with him directly, Ambassador Briggs and General Mark Clark, are writing back to Washington and they're saying, we're going to probably have to offer him a mutual defense treaty to get him to go along with this, which they do on 8 June 1953. They put a mutual defense treaty on the table. That's 10 days before he releases the 28,000 Korean POWs. So he does that when he already knows a defense treaty is on the table because he thinks it's worth one last attempt to kill the armistice. When that doesn't happen, he then accepts the offer of a mutual defense treaty with a lot of conditions, deciding that if the armistice is going to happen, if Korea is going to be divided, then at least we need this sort of relationship with the United States. So that is the origin of the US-Korean alliance, the alliance that we call ironclad today, that I think both societies are rightly very proud of. It doesn't start there. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that Lee Syngman absolutely wrings this alliance out of the United States, and it's an alliance that they do not want to give and only give at the last minute, understanding that they have to do this if they want him to abide by the Armistice Agreement.
Right. Recognizing we're almost going into overtime, and I still want to turn to the audience. But if I can just wrap up with that. Syngman Rhee was pivotal in getting the alliance. You could almost say if Syngman Rhee were not a leader, there wouldn't be a mutual defense treaty.
I don't think that there was another Korean leader at the time who could have gotten that out of the United States. And I don't think there was another leader at the time who was willing to risk as much as Rhee did. As many of you know, there was a plan to remove Lee Syngman from power that they thought about exercising both in 1952 and 1953
Right.
and decided not to, but it was under consideration because of his obstinance to the armistice.
Right. And then in Korea, I wonder, so what's the public perception of Lee Syngman in Korea? Is a lot of complexity here? Are his contributions towards establishing the alliance appreciated?
So this has changed a lot over the period of time that I've studied Syngman Rhee. So I came into my PhD programming knowing that I wanted to study Lee Syngman. So I've studied Syngman Rhee for about 15 years. And during the first few years when I was researching in the ROK, it wasn't uncommon that I would have to explain to Koreans my age or younger who Lee Syngman was and what his contributions were. They all knew the name. They knew he was some sort of political figure, but they really didn't know too much about him. And that has changed dramatically today. But unfortunately, while I think Lee Syngman is much better known today, just 15 years later, he's also become an incredibly polarizing issue between Koreans on the one hand who tend to be on the conservative side of the spectrum, who view him as the founder of the ROK and the father of Korean democracy and the author of the US-Korean Security Alliance, and then Koreans on the more liberal end of the spectrum who view him as the author of the division of Korea, who hold him responsible for massive human rights abuses at the beginning of the Korean War, which I think is largely justified, and then also who believe that maybe he did not do enough to curb Japanese collaborators in the post-liberation period. So just this spring, a really low-budget historical documentary came out, Kunguk Chuncheng, or Birth of Korea, by a Korean filmmaker named Kim Dok-young, which, beyond everybody's expectations, ended up being a wild box office success. I believe it's now the third highest grossing documentary film in Korean history. And what happened with that film is all of the conservatives turned out in droves and saw it and loved it. And all of the liberals decried it as really a whitewashing of Syngman Rhee's legacy. And so when I talk to Koreans, I tell them, I'm an American. I have no emotional connection to Syngman Rhee. So I don't care if you love him or if you hate him, as long as you love him for historically accurate reasons or hate him for historically accurate reasons. So if you admire Lee Syngman for his leadership of the Korean independence movement for 40 years, a period where there was almost no hope that Korea would ever be an independent nation again before Pearl Harbor. If you admire him for that, that makes a lot of sense to me. If you admire him for his ability to wring a mutual defense treaty out of the United States, I understand that. At the same time, if you really have an issue with Lee Syngman's legacy because of the massive human rights abuses at the beginning of the Korean War, especially things like the Bodo League massacre, that makes sense to me. If you really have a problem with his legacy because of the actions that he took, running roughshod over the Korean legislature, that makes sense to me as well. If you have an issue with him for refusing to step down from power when that's really what his country needed. They really needed a transition, a peaceful transition to democracy. And they didn't get that. And as a result, ironically, he almost strangles at birth the Korean democracy that he had done so much to foster. So I think there are good reasons to love Lee Syngman. There are good reasons to also have some very negative feelings about his legacy. So I think he's going to be polarized in South Korea really for the foreseeable future.
Right. Well, it's almost the subject of another program here, the complexities of Lee Syngman. But the fact is that his efforts brought about the Alliance and Mutual Defense Treaty.
Yes.
Sal, did you want to say something?
Yeah, could I say one thing?
Go ahead.
Quickly? I should have mentioned this before, but there's a lot of other supporting units in the Korean War. John, will you stand up, please? This gentleman here was only 16, and he was what is called the Katyushas. Now, the Katyushas was a special unit of teenagers that fought the North Koreans and also the Chinese, and he was also an interpreter. So he was never... all the armed forces were greatly involved, but the Katyushas were more specials. They were specially trained. Thank you, John.
Mm-hmm.
And now in D.C., the Wall of Remembrance, the expanded part of the Korean War Memorial, has the names of those Katyushas who died, along with the American soldiers they were supporting.
Yes,
so their names are
71,000
written on the wall as well. Right. Thanks for bringing that up. So let me just wrap up with Rachel, with Professor Kim. So, what is the state of the military alliance between the U.S. and Korea? Is it rock solid? Is it will it be? What are the challenges? Can you give us some indication? Your perspective from West Point in 60 seconds or something like that.
There's one phrase, if you ever go to Korea, it's 같이 갑시다. And that is the strength of the alliance. And as you can see, that both countries truly care about the alliance. Its future is, again, subject to perhaps more political volatility. But the strength and the culture and the emotional aspect of that alliance is still very much strong. When I served my company command at Dongducheon, Camp Casey in South Korea, I felt it from the community. I felt it from the Katyusas, which stand for Korean Augmentees United States Army. So they're embedded in American formations, but under the Korean Army. And so that's also a testament to the alliance. And now increasing structures. So CFC, right? That's a combined actual command structure. I think that's also a testament to the strength. So again, 같이 갑시다. That'll be the motto of our alliance for many years to come.
Okay, great. And thanks for your service too, Rachel. So we have some time for Q&A. Chelsea, you want to give a mic? So, Sean, go ahead.
Hi, Sean King, Park Strategies. First, Sal and Major Kim, thank you so much for your service. Dr. Fields, thank you for whatever you do.
Not much.
Sal, it's so important you mentioned the people after the actual hostilities ended, because a lot of these think tanks functions often in a self-flagellating manner. We think, where did we go wrong with North Korea? But where did we go right with South Korea? That's the real story. So thank you. Can we have another round of applause for all these gentlemen? Major Kim, you're so right, because after the Korean War, most people bet on North Korea to succeed versus the South, because it was more industrial. Japan had industrialized the North as a bridge to Manchuria. So most ethnic Koreans in Japan, despite being from what was the South, chose North Korean passports over South Korean because they thought the North was going to succeed. So Dr. Fields, for as little as you've done, my question is actually for you. So much of ethno-nationalist left South Korean popular culture, movies, their English titles like Taxi Driver or Default, tend to be anti-conservative or anti-right. Has there been any re-reckoning, especially in the Yoon Suk-yeol era, of Syngman Rhee's role in Korean independence in South Korea? Has Yoon Suk-yeol himself talked about Syngman Rhee, or is that such a sensitive issue that nobody wants to talk about him? Is he persona non grata in South Korea? Or where does he stand in the average South Korean's view today? Thank you very much, and thank you again for a great event.
Oh, he's certainly not persona non grata, but I think there is a question of whether his legacy is more positive than negative. There is a movement right now in Korea to establish a Syngman Rhee memorial, or an Iseungman Kinyam Kwan, where his contributions to the founding of the ROK would be commemorated. And that has the support of many Koreans, but there's also many Koreans who are opposed to that because of actions that he took during the Korean War and actions that he took that really harmed the democratic process in South Korea. So I think it's an issue that's very much being worked out right now. He has his supporters and he has his detractors, and what sort of commemoration does he deserve, if any at all, is under active consideration. But I wouldn't say he's persona non grata whatsoever. I don't know that Yoon Suk-yeol has made any specific statements about Iseungman. Consul General Kim might know much better than I do, but I know that people in his staff were talking about the film Kunguk Chanchang and encouraging people to go see it. And so I think the rumor was that he approved of that film. I don't know if he ever said anything officially or not, but yeah.
Okay. Do we have another question? Oh, yeah. This gentleman in the middle. Can you just identify who you are and then ask a question?
Sure. My name is Sunny Chu. I'm just I guess, a sympathizer, of the cause of the Korea Society. Thank you both for your service and your comments today. I guess my question, unfortunately, is also for the professor. I'm just curious, when you talk about Syngman Rhee and his hesitancy to come to the armistice table, I'm curious, very briefly, what the factors were that would have driven North Korea to the armistice table. What made them willing to, sue for a pause rather than keep pushing?
I think actually the North Koreans wanted to come to the armistice table earlier, and it was actually Joseph Stalin who was keeping both the Chinese and the North Koreans from the armistice table because it was an ideal situation for Joseph Stalin. You have Americans pouring their forces in, losing tens of thousands of soldiers in an area that he believes is of marginal importance, and that actually most Americans believe is of marginal importance. The real battle is going to be in Europe, and Joseph Stalin manages to get the United States bogged down in Korea. So it's my understanding, and historians like Catherine Weathersby have written much more about this, but actually Joseph Stalin is preventing armistice talks from really progressing to the point where they will come to any sort of completion until he dies in March of 1953. And that's when they get very, very serious. I think that the North Koreans had to admit that, in June of 1950, they rolled the dice that they would be able to conquer all of South Korea before anyone intervened. And when the United States and the UN intervened, they simply do not have the resources, the logistics to seriously hope to conquer the peninsula anymore. And in fact, if it wasn't for the Chinese intervention in October, they would have completely lost. I mean, there would be no North Korea today. So yeah, there was really no possibility for them to go on the offensive with their own resources, really, after the Incheon landing, certainly.
Right. One more question?
As succinctly as possible, what's the main
So
lesson?
this is Jonathan Corrado, the director of our policy programs. I recognize you.
You recognize him.
What's the main lesson that we should learn from the Korean War and apply it today? And I think we got one more
Didn't hear
question
the
after me
question
as
at
well.
all.
So this is a question to everyone on the panel? Yeah. Okay.
I don't know what
Sal.
the question. I don't know what the question was.
What's the biggest lesson from the Korean War and that we can apply today?
What we could apply today. Well, as we see today, the strongest and the most longest alliance in the world is between Korea and the United States. And I think the unity of our two countries should show the world that that's what we should have, unity and an experience of the Korean War. And I believe wholeheartedly that if the high echelon would ever look at the situation of the Korean War, how it was fought and how it was won and how it stand out to be. And I think we should learn a big lesson in that.
Great. It's Rachel.
Yeah, I guess the biggest lesson is that it's not over. And that, once again, history can repeat itself, and we have to learn from it. And now we're in an era of great near-peer competition of China that entered the Korean War. How is that going to affect and impact our geopolitical strategy in Indo-PACOM? That's what keeps me up at night. What is the role that Korea has to play in this next conflict? For example, I took some cadets to the museum in Chupyeong-ri, the monument to the Battle of Chupyeong-ri, and learned that the PRC sends their military officers to study that conflict because they had lost that particular battle during the Korean War. So the biggest lesson for me is that when I look across my formations, my soldiers and my cadets, is that we have to understand the nuances of our society now, but that conflict is not over, and we have to always prepare and train and be ready for that.
Right. And the view from the historian.
Well, I guess what's kept me up many nights thinking about this history is, what does it look like if the United States never suggests the division of Korea in the first place in August of 1945? And I can tell you that Syngman Rhee really wished that never would have happened, that he believed that Korea had a better chance of independence if it was united, and he would have gone on leading the Korean independence movement against communism, but he wouldn't have had an ally between him and the Soviet Union. It complicated things immensely on the Korean Peninsula. And then also the United States undertook what was a massive and very complicated occupation with no planning for it whatsoever. And so the American occupation of Korea from 45 to 48 is really a disaster at almost every single level. It leads to unprecedented levels of political violence, which we forget about because they're less than the Korean War, but it was an incredibly chaotic and violent time. And there's an alternate universe out there where Northeast Asia is more stable today, and where millions of people do not die in a war because the United States doesn't suggest to do that. Now, there's also an alternate universe out there where maybe the Korean Peninsula today looks like North Korea, only bigger. So as a historian, I don't know which one. I don't know what the outcome would have been, but I think it makes me very sympathetic for policymakers, actually, that they have to make very, very big decisions on a moment's notice. And even when they think that they're doing the right thing, the idea is we get boots on the ground to make sure that we can ensure that Korea re-emerges from Japanese colonialism as an independent nation. If we have boots on the ground, we can keep it from slipping into the Soviet orbit. But the cost of that policy over the next 10 or over the next 8 years at least are just so staggeringly high that one has to contemplate what the alternatives might have been.
Right. Well, we could go through these counterfactuals. They're fascinating. But my big takeaway is that we're better off having the alliance. It has stability in the and provides stability in the area. It ensures the peace and prosperity, and increasingly, economically and industrially, we're all becoming very dependent on each other. So this is we can talk about the what ifs and all that, but we're in a stronger position with it.
Can I just say one thing about
Sure,
the
go
alliance
ahead.
too? I feel like the alliance really comes into its own when South Korea democratizes.
Right.
And the alliance is so much better today because South Korean society and government and American society and government are more on the same page than they were ever during the Park Chung-hee period. You know, so so remember the Koreagate
That's a good point.
scandal of the
Yes.
1970s. I mean, there's a lot of struggles in the alliance because the governments are just not compatible and the societies are a bit incompatible. And I think the more South Korea democratizes, the more they have this vibrant democracy, the closer that this alliance has become.
Jonathan, you were
Question.
okay. Why not? One more question. Go ahead. Oh, Joan, I didn't recognize you in the. Go ahead, but I can hear you.
Can't hear you.
So Joan's at the Columbia University at the right.
So my question, I think, is really directed toward either major humor, Dr. Fields, and as I think it was Dr. Fields, as you were talking, I was thinking. And thank you. I was just thinking to myself about the miracle on the Whan, and that was obviously decades coming. So I wondered if either of you could talk a little bit about that as compared to West Germany immediately after the Second World War and into the earlier, or that second half of the 20th century. What was it, just a matter of the United States prioritizing West Germany security-wise? Was there a racial dimension there? I mean, what was really the difference, do you think, in your opinion?
Not too familiar too much with West Germany, but I think there was a very unique recipe with South Korea's rapid economic development from a homogenous cultural standpoint, the unity in the reconstruction efforts, as well as very precise policy making. As you said, there are trade-offs, but understanding those trade-offs for an outcome that you necessarily can't predict at that time. And so, question to maybe the uniqueness of the miracle on Whan, is that more so the question, or? Right. Yeah, I think it was also for Europe in the Marshall Plan, primarily for humanitarian aid, but in South Korea, it was number one to reinvest those the humanitarian capital of foreign aid into infrastructure projects, because that was fundamentally the capital that will now enable economic growth. So that's one. It's a reinvestment into capital and infrastructure. And second was building their own domestic base. So instead of having FDIs or foreign direct investments for multinational corporations, which may not be entirely sustainable for domestic growth, they ensured that those FDIs, in terms of capital, built a robust domestic base. And from there, they were not so subject to volatile supply chains or from, I guess, corporations with different objectives. I think that was key to the difference in terms of the infrastructure evolution between the two regions.
Maybe I will just add that I think Syngman Rhee's land reform was an absolutely crucial prerequisite that needed to happen for Korea's development. It was a necessary condition, but it was not a sufficient condition. And actually, for most of his administration, he is a terrible economic manager. And one of the things that holds the Republic of Korea back is he refuses to normalize relations with Japan, which means that the ROK is dependent on aid from the United States. They're surrounded by communists in Japan, and they won't trade with Japan. And when Park Chung-hee comes to power, he is the one that takes the very, very unpopular step to normalize relations with Japan. That and the Vietnam War, which turns out to be a massive stimulus to the ROK economy, I think goes a long way to explaining the Korean development that will come quite a bit later, but it's those strategic investments made after Rhee that I think make the biggest difference.
Well, that's a good setup to our next program.
Okay, good.
But today I think we're done. And so thank you all for joining us. And I think we have sandwiches, right, that we'll offer.
Yeah, so please hang out with us, get a chance to talk to the veterans and our expert speakers. Right in the kitchen to the left of the stage, we've got some sandwiches set out, so please hang out and have some lunch with us. And we got cheesecake, because cheesecake is the American way. So,
Stay
so
seated,
thanks
no,
everybody
no
for coming.
screwdrivers.
Let's give
Don't
our
stand up
panelists
yet.
one more round of
Get
applause.
this,